Hello and welcome to The Sound of Economics. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie for Bruegel, and I'm joined by senior fellows Nicolas Veron and Simone Tagliapietra. We are here today to talk about the intersection of war and markets. There has been a lot of turmoil geopolitically and also financially, particularly in the last couple of weeks since Hamas attacked Israel and military operations began. There is a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the region and a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen in markets. Nicola, would you like to start out by helping listeners who may be coming to this either in a couple of days or later on, but what are the main things we should be looking at? Stock markets in the region obviously have been affected. Military and technology companies are affected. The dollar is back, but the U.S. also has its own problems. What all is in play right now?
I think the first thing to say is that markets react really very differently from human beings. So there is no such thing as Mr. Market, or if there is such thing, that person doesn't have a heart. There are very dramatic events. Of course, in the Middle East, it's a major geopolitical shock. The reaction of markets have been relatively mild. And the reason for that is that they still see it as a localized crisis. So if it's localized, it's peripheral to the global financial system and the global economy. Of course, the oil prices and energy prices are the exception to that. But so far, the conflict, for all the people who have died and for all the dramatic implications of it for Israel, and a number of other places in the region, it hasn't really disrupted the fundamentals of globally significant market parameters. So I think that would be my main thing to start. The markets will really react in a big way. They have reacted in a number of significant ways, as you mentioned, but they will only react in a big way if there are things that go far beyond just geopolitical events, but things that directly affect financially and economically significant parameters.
Simone, you are our go-to person on energy markets. What are some of the most significant parameters there, and what should we be looking for?
As Nicolas said, also in the case, I would say, of energy markets, the conflict is, for now, seen as, predominantly being localized, in the sense that we haven't seen, for now, major repercussions on oil and gas markets, for example. So when you look at the oil market, we need to consider that, of course, Israel is not an oil-producing country, and there are no major international oil infrastructures running through the area that is interested by the military operations. And as a result of this, there are no direct implications from the conflict on oil markets. However, oil market analysts are very attentive to what could happen to Iran. So what could be the outlook with a potential involvement of Iran in this situation? And the reason there is that Iran is, of course, a very important oil-producing country. It is an oil-producing country that has been heavily affected by sanctions over the last years, and namely after 2018, when the Trump administration abandoned the Iran nuclear deal and restored U.S. sanction on Iranian oil, has seen a sharp decrease in its oil production, 30-year low, and also exports. But since last year, the Biden administration, without changing anything on the sanctions regime, has basically turned a blind eye on the enforcement of these sanctions, allowing Iran to ramp up its production and exports. So the major element of risk for oil markets today is the fact that the US might restart enforcing these sanctions on Iranian oil, bringing out of the market important volumes, which could, according to several analysts, push the oil price to $100 per barrel, with all the related implications, for example, on inflation. When it comes to gas, the situation, I would say, has been much more direct, for the very simple reason that Israel is a gas-producing country. Israel has found over the last decade important gas deposits in the offshore waters of the Mediterranean, Leviathan, Tamar, and others. And as a result of the attack, the government has asked to shut down one of these gas fields. Why is this important? Because 70% of the electricity in Israel is generated with gas. And with this shutdown, the utilities in Israel need to basically shift to other fuels for the electricity generation. The other implication is that Israel might not be able to export gas to Egypt as it has been doing for the last years. And this will affect Egypt's capability to export LNG. Last year, Egypt has exported to global markets, namely to Europe, 7 million tons of LNG, which is not that much in comparison to the 95 million tons of the EU LNG imports, of course. But in a very tight LNG markets we are in, each single LNG cargo matters. So the preoccupation from a gas market perspective is that this situation, if prolonged, can really dent the Egyptian capability to keep up LNG exports, which could put some pressure also on the gas price in Europe as a result, because Europe, after the Russian weaponization of gas last year, has turned to the LNG market to the rescue, and therefore is today very much resilient on what happens on this global market.
So we've seen Europe really try hard to save up for a rainy day in terms of filling its LNG stores and also thinking about its geostrategic risk in addition to its other economic goals. Nicolas, what does it mean to have another military conflict so close to the EU as we're still getting used to the one that began in 2022 between Russia and its invasion of Ukraine?
I know, of course, this is very early and too early to answer that question because it has so many different threads to it. But I think the key question here is the EU capacity to act as a unitary bloc in these new neighborhood conflicts in a way that he didn't do, of course, during the war in Yugoslavia, but also not really during the war in Syria. It did in Ukraine, acting forcefully on the non-military front with sanctions, financial sanctions, support to Ukraine, and even on the military front, not directly fighting, but with weapons procurement. And now the question is whether it can do something comparable to the extent that Europe is directly involved in the Middle East. And that will, of course, have to do with something the EU has been doing for a long time, which is providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian territories, but also any other development that we cannot even think of right now because events are unfolding by and large quite fast. This is important for financial markets because it has read across for Europe's financial capacity. It is very plausible, even so at this point, it hasn't really happened at scale, that at some point the European Union will need to mobilize significant funding for costs that are connected with these geopolitical developments. I say it hasn't happened at scale, of course. I mean, not in a comparable way to the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic, which triggered Next Generation EU, which doesn't mean that nothing has happened in that department. Of course, the non-military financial assistance to Ukraine, which I've referred to, is very significant even by the standards of the entire EU. So I think that's a place to watch. Will we have a need for new EU spending that is linked to the geopolitical developments, of course, assuming that we don't come to the worst case scenario, which is that security turmoil affects the EU itself, which hasn't happened yet, but that can always be a tail risk. So that would be what I would watch first.
Simone, do you see political unity or more arguments in terms of managing the energy supply? I'm thinking particularly in the transition away from Russian gas. There were different member states with competing interests, and it took a while to get people on the same page.
Yes, I think that Europe is today in a much more resilient position that many could have expected, given the major energy storm, I would say perfect energy storm we went through last year. Europe has been able in 2022 to secure political unity and avoid a fragmentation of the internal market, meaning that basically countries could have shut down their own energy market borders, not to trade electricity and gas with neighboring countries during scarcity. That didn't happen. We have maintained solidarity and shared the resources, and the result, also thanks to good policies that have been implemented at national and EU level, is that today we have the storages of gas that you mentioned being completely full ahead of the winter. We have gas demand that remains reduced in Europe by a level of 15% vis-a-vis the levels before the energy crisis, and we have had the capacity to roll out the infrastructure required to bring LNG into Germany and other countries that didn't have access to LNG before. So all in all, I think we are in a resilient position, even if we are in a new normal where prices continue to remain higher than we used to see before, and volatility continues to characterize a market that otherwise has been more stable in the past. We need to get used to this new normal. We need to adjust. We see countries reacting, for example, with new subsidies idea for industrial electricity prices. All of these, I think, will be at the center. These industrial repercussions of the energy crisis will be at the center of our economic policy agenda when it comes to energy for the coming months.
When we come back, we'll talk more about the future financial needs related to all of this conflict. Welcome back to The Sound of Economics at Bruegel. I'm here with Nicolas Veron and Simone Tagliapietra. We are looking now at the incredible costs that will come from this new conflict in the Middle East, as well as the humanitarian costs already underway. Something like 1.4 million people in Gaza are displaced, and they're going to need financial help, and possibly could be much more than that. Meanwhile, the EU has more or less agreed on how to support Ukraine financially, but it hasn't signed off, as we record this, on the new budget because of disagreements about what to pay for in Europe. Simone, given all of the green transition needs, all of the investment needs, all of the moving money from this pot to the other pot, how is the EU going to finish what it started and come up with the money it might need for these future challenges?
We have estimated that we are talking about a gap of 190 billion euros between 2024 and 2030 in terms of EU green grants. And that's how we think a new EU green investment plan should be pitched after the end of Next Generation EU, something to maintain the current level of commitment by the EU so that we make sure to have a significant carrot, let's say, for countries to move forward in the decarbonization process and maintain the objectives that we agreed under the European Green Deal.
That's a big gap in terms of investment. Policymakers like to talk about crowding in private investment and encouraging more market activity to fill in where government activity can't do it all on its own. Nicola, how does the state of the financial system play into this, particularly in Europe, where it's been very bank dependent and very bank heavy, and the environment has been changing a lot since the euro crisis?
I think there are two issues here. One is the funding of public expenditure, and the second one is the funding of private sector expenditure. And as you just said rightly, there are complex dynamics of crowding out or crowding in between these two. But in a way, the state of the European financial system affects both because we are in a process of transition from a financial system which was basically organized on a purely country-by-country national basis before the Eurozone crisis to a system that has increasing supranational features, both for sovereign finance and for private sector finance. For sovereign finance, of course, it's something on which you have written a lot, Rebecca, which is next generation EU, the issuance of EU debt by the European Commission at scale, the fact that EU debt has some, but not all features of national sovereign bonds, including in terms of rating, index inclusion, liquidity, etc. And in terms of the private sector, it's of course the banking union, which is unfinished business, but has moved the European financial sector a bit closer to the vision of a single market for financial service. I say a bit closer because, of course, we're still far from there. And the banking system is not very integrated, even after the integration of banking supervision. The capital markets are also, in a way, they should be more integrated because they're more wholesale, but they're also pretty fragmented. And the European Commission has been talking about capital markets union for now nearly a decade, but it has been mostly an empty piece of rhetoric, given the very modest amount of actual policy actions that has occurred in that area. So here we are with a still very complex, largely fragmented financial sectors that will have to sustain enormous investments for the climate transition, but also for whatever needs the geopolitical situation has for us, which we cannot exactly predict right now. And if we had enough foresight, probably we would act on this to prepare for a system that could mobilize much greater amounts more quickly.
I'd like to highlight two challenges that you mentioned just now, in that Europe is trying to make its financial markets more cross-border, and it's also trying to make them more market-oriented and less bank loan-oriented. Do those things need to move in lockstep, or could we just see more cross-border lending that sidesteps some of the CMU activity that hasn't yet happened?
I mean, as I said, and very sadly, the CMU, Capital Markets Union, has been largely an empty promise. And I think it is fair to question the extent to which, policy-wise, the European Union really wants to displace the dominance of banks in its financial system. I think there is a clear aspiration to the objective of having a more integrated capital market, even so decision makers are not willing to make the political sacrifices that this would entail on the idea of displacing the boundary between bank-based and market-based finance and reduce the roles of the banks in the European economy. Frankly, I'm not sure even at the level of principles there is really a willingness to do that beyond what we have in pure rhetorical terms. So I would be very cautious about that.
Do you think the banks have the capital to do what we need them to do, given all of that?
At this point, they don't. And our financial sector more generally does not have the mojo, does not have the firepower to finance what we need, especially for the climate transition. And again, I'm very concerned about this. Any needs we may have in the future to mobilize funding for geopolitical needs. At this point, we can afford because the amounts needed for Ukraine or reconstruction in Gaza going forward are not massive from a European perspective, but we might be facing other situations in the future. So I think this should be a high-level concern, and it is not enough of it. But I think at the end of the day, there is a lot that can be done with the banking sector. Of course, the government financing is largely market-based in Europe. We have efficient sovereign bond markets. And the fact that the corporate financing is this mix between banks and markets, I think is not in itself crippling, with a possible exception, which is the high-growth startup sector, where I think there is one of the greatest rationales for developing capital markets. But we have also to be humble because as economists, we don't understand the interplay between the strengths of venture capital funding and the strengths of market finance more generally. So there's a lot to be done on the analytical front as well in that space.
You mentioned government funding. One of the EU's big achievements of the last few years is, as you said, its public borrowing for NGEU and more broadly establishing a public financing capacity. One thing that strikes me right now is the ongoing resistance, not just to continuing the borrowing, which people have kind of gotten used to because it brings in money, but to financing the borrowing costs associated with that. As we record this, as I said, there's a debate over whether the EU should come up with new money just to pay the maintenance on the bonds that it's issued, or whether it should look for unused money in the innovation funds and the investment funds. I would say from my own work that the EU's biggest challenge in selling bonds is credibility. And if I were an EU policymaker, I would want to do everything I could to convince the bond markets that this was a good, safe investment. So I would cough up the interest costs. I would make this permanent. I would do everything I could to show that liquidity and consistency was something Europe was good for, because I would think that would bring borrowing costs down and save money in the long run. Simone, what is the risk of shortchanging these innovation funds? The people who would like to do this are saying this money isn't being spent anyway. We may as well use it for something. But I think you may have done some work on the importance of having this money available, even if it's hard to get it out the door.
Indeed, I think this conversation we are having here is very relevant also to the other major conversation ongoing in the economic policy space in Europe, which is, of course, around industrial policy in general and clean tech industrial policy in specific. And what we have seen is from the European Commission over the last months, proposal of a Net Zero Industry Act that basically tries to address this challenge and the major competitiveness push that comes from the IRA, and that has, of course, represented a major challenge for Europe and will represent a major challenge for Europe moving forward, in a way that basically focuses on an import substitution strategy cornered around an objective of 40% of manufacturing capacity covering our deployment needs by 2030 in Europe, mainly through a strategy to foster the permitting for these factories. What we have been writing a lot on this, also together with our director, Jeremy Zettemeyer, and our senior fellow, René de Wegelers, is that this is clearly not sufficient. This is wrong in terms of objective. We push back this import substitution approach that the Commission has proposed, but we also think that the permitting is not necessarily the most important bottleneck we have in Europe when it comes to clean tech investments. I think what we have been discussing here about the over-reliance on banks and the lack of venture capital in Europe is as important as a bottleneck as the permitting. You can add on that a major lack of skills we have in Europe when it comes to these technologies, and also major problem with high energy prices and a great differential between EU and US energy prices. That is another major comparative disadvantage for Europe. So this is to say that the agenda that Nicolas was referring to is extremely relevant to the industrial policy discussion we are having. And indeed, this should be basically at the center of what will have to be a new industrial policy agenda in the next institutional cycle as of next year, that most likely will drive the European priorities for the coming years, an industrial policy agenda that doesn't focus on the shortcuts, but on the framework conditions that are necessary for Europe to be competitive and attractive for private investments.
And you talk about the competitive effect of the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., the IRA legislation. When we come back, we will return to this transatlantic dynamic and what it might mean going forward. Welcome back to The Sound of Economics. Simone, what are we looking at in terms of this transatlantic vibe between the U.S. and the EU in terms of energy markets and investment spending and coping with all the shocks that keep popping up around the world?
Yes, so the approval of the Inflation Reduction Act a year ago and these $370 billion at least in terms of subsidies. I say at least because there is no cap there. So this might also fly as an amount to, even $1 trillion actually over the next years. It has represented an important driver for a new industrial policy conversation in Europe. Basically, the fear here is that given this massive subsidization in the US, we might lose competitiveness when it comes to green investments on batteries manufacturing, electric vehicles manufacturing, and solar and wind energy manufacturers moving forward. Now, is this a legitimate concern? Yes, it is a legitimate concern because Europe is an economy that relies also on a number of carbon-intensive sectors that will have to be very much transformed during the green transition. And we will need new green jobs to replace these current brown jobs. And if we don't do that, we will have a big deal of a social problem when it comes to implementing our green agenda. So this is a legitimate concern, but we also don't need to overreact, because if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, most of the funding in there goes to the deployment of these technologies, and Europe has been heavily subsidizing the deployment of renewables as well in the past, and continues to do so. What's the problem we have with the Inflation Reduction Act is mainly on the discriminatory measures that are contained in there that are not WTO compliant, and that's where Europe said very clearly we push back against those provisions that contain local content requirements and so on that are against the current international trade system. And I think that is a position which is not only genuine, but is also amplified by the fact that on the other hand, you've got China and the threat of China now entering other markets than the usual solar panel industry, etc., and namely the EVs market. And that's exactly why during the State of the Union, we have seen Ursula von der Leyen putting forward the announcement of the launch of an anti-subsidy investigation procedure against Chinese EVs, with a clear message that Europe want to send out there. Look, we are not naive. We do want an open and fair trade system. We are here able to stand and to basically make sure that we all play by the same rules. We are not willing to be the only ones out there playing by the rules of the game we have set together.
And all of this is really hard to manage even when things are stable, which they're not right now. We began this podcast talking about the conflict in the Middle East, which is a couple of weeks old at this point. We're a year plus into Russia's ongoing fight with Ukraine. We've got the dollar as a place where traditionally investors have looked to for security, but also because of the constant threat of shutdown and the U.S. insecurity. Maybe it's not in its regular role. Nicola, how does the EU manage this, given that it's trying to compete with the U.S. for investment, it's trying to balance its reliance on China, and it's trying to make sure that things that happen in the neighborhood don't set off a bigger fire?
I think the conflict in Ukraine is existential for the EU, and the EU has the heads of state and government, maybe not everybody in the public opinion, but the heads of state and government, with the obvious exception of Mr. Orban and Mr. Fico, are aligned in realizing how existential this fight is.
Those are the leaders of Hungary and Slovakia, fellow listeners.
That's right. So the war in Ukraine, in my perception, dominates every other consideration. And what that means in practice is that the EU, in my reading, is willing to tolerate unconstructive behavior by both the US and China that in other circumstances it would have pushed back against, perhaps more forcefully. But in the current circumstances, it cannot really afford to, because it needs the global economy to hum along, but it also needs the US, very importantly, to participate, fingers crossed, in the alliance against Russia and in favor of Ukraine. So I think this environment weighs very heavily on the trade dispute that you're referring to, because it means that the US government, even when it acts unconstructively and against the global rules-based order that it pretends to defend, gets a lot of slack from the EU. I think that's inevitable. I wouldn't criticize this general stance that I understand to be the one of not only the European Commission, but the EU as a whole at this point. And I think we'll have to live with it as long as we have the situation in Ukraine the way we have it. Obviously, the war in the Middle East is going to evolve. We'll see whether it escalates, but at this point, it doesn't come near the critical, vital importance that the war in Ukraine has for the EU.
So we've got trade disputes on the east with China. We've got trade disputes in the west with the U.S. Simone, what is our biggest risk in the next 6 months, would you say?
Well, when it comes to energy and the climate space, the major risk is, of course, disruption of infrastructures. And that is a major element of vulnerability we have in Europe for the winter. I think we are in for a safe winter, but we should absolutely make sure not to see acts basically of sabotage at our infrastructure, namely important pipelines connecting major suppliers like Algeria and Norway to Europe. The disruption of the Baltic connector that is still being investigated has sounded the alarm bell that something can still happen at our infrastructure, like we have seen last year with Nord Stream. And I think this is a risk that Europe will really have difficulties to manage in case something happens there. So I think raising security levels as currently being done by governments after also the recent incident at the Baltic connector is very important, because we sit on a very tight market and we cannot afford to have any act of disruption of the infrastructure in the coming months.
So the biggest risk may be the disruption we don't see coming, and that's why it's important to prepare for the disruptions we might see coming. I would add that another big risk is that central banks won't get the economic balance right, and a recession could come up or inflation could come back. That's pretty scary. Nicola, what would you say is the big risk, particularly financially, looking at the next few months?
As you suggested, Rebecca, the biggest risk are probably the ones we don't have on our map. So I will just observe that the banking sector in Europe seems to be reasonably resilient. We had, of course, an episode of financial weakness of banking sector turmoil in the US in March this year, which was echoed for different reasons in Switzerland with Credit Suisse. And it was, to me, quite remarkable to see the Eurozone banking sector in particular not being subject to financial contagion at all at that point, except for a few hours in the case of Deutsche Bank, which turned out to be speculation that didn't succeed. So that shouldn't, of course, generate complacency. But I think when you compare that to where we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago during the Eurozone crisis, the contrast is actually quite remarkable. And I think there are lessons to be drawn from that contrast in terms of the effectiveness that we can achieve at the European level when we actually do things together, which is the case with banking supervision now, and that could read across to other issues.
Thank you both for talking through the state of play on this episode of The Sound of Economics. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. You can find this episode and many others, along with all of our fine publications, on our website, bruegel.org. And this podcast is available on all of your regular podcast streaming channels. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.